the timing. But we were so excited by the opportunity presented by Julie Daum being in town. Kari was already on to talk about the topic, but it's been fantastic that we've been able to bring together two fantastic speakers at such short notice and also get a really great crowd. So I appreciate it very much for everybody. I want to highlight the one event that is still coming up in the year, November 15th, and CD, we can talk, and you may want to share something, but one aspect of what is happening with ethics this year is going to be a workshop. We're in discussions with Mediate BC to try and create something that is a joint session that will meet different needs and that will allow for greater online participation from people around the province. So you'll hear more about it, but mark the date if you're interested in ensuring that you get your 2 hours of ethics workshop time. And Carrie Gallant will be leading that again this year. After that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to just take it on. Words matter. Kerry Boil and Julie Daum.
All right. Thank you. Am I in the right spot? So it's just an incredible honor to be here and to be asked to talk about this really, really important topic. And so how many of you, just want to do a little bit of a survey, so I can't involve the people online in this easily, so I apologize, but how many of you in the room have ever given feedback to anyone? Yeah, okay. I think for online, that was pretty much everyone. And so how many in the room have actually received feedback from someone else about anything? This is really a topic that isn't just about conflict resolution, it's about life and any kind of situation across the board. So it's impossible for Julie and I to actually cover this in an hour and a half. I'm sorry to disappoint you. You could probably spend an entire week in a workshop on this easily. And the other thing I wanted to, but we're going to try and give you as much as we can in the time available. The other point is that a lot of this stuff will be so familiar to you in the audience, coming from the conflict resolution field. You'll recognize so much of the principles and the brain science that we're going to go through, and so it'll be very familiar to you. But what I found in my own life is that we may know that stuff when we're the independent neutral third party or whatever, but when it's coming at us personally, or we personally have to deliver it, sometimes what we know professionally kind of goes out the window. And I had a personal experience with that, which I'll just share at the beginning. I received some pretty stinging feedback from a colleague, and instead of coming to me directly, went above my head to my supervisor with it. And when I received it, my first response was, the lawyer in me bubbled up. And without even thinking, my first response was, well, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and my fingers were going, and I was typing out a chronology of what really happened, and how this was wrong, and basically trying to justify what happened, and expressing my hurt in a lawyer-like way. And so, instead of pausing and reflecting and finding the kernel of whatever and trying to meet in relationship with this person who was my colleague, it started off, and then I did self-correct a little while later, but it was a really interesting example of how sometimes our knowledge doesn't actually help us when it's personal. So we want to talk about some of the personal stuff, and some of the examples that we'll think of are going to be workplace, but they could equally be family. They could equally be professional client, anything you can think of. So speeding through, the first piece we're going to do is just, and I'm going to take this piece, which is like a basics piece, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just going through giving you what resources I can find. And I have to say, most of you in the room, as I say, are going to know way more about this than I do. But whenever you're leading a session like this, you end up always learning so much, and it's a really good personal reminder, so I thank you for that opportunity. And if I'm speeding through things, I'm embedded in the presentation and on the PowerPoint are some materials you can take away and think about later. I hope they're helpful.
And I will just say, the power... I'm saying this actually for the people in the room, so I'll step forward anyway. Because it'll matter. If you're online, you found the link, and you found that the slides are actually in PDF form on the CoRe site at the speaker series thing, but they're there for download afterwards as well for everybody.
Okay, and then that's all a lead-in to Julie's piece, which she was so gracious to agree to come and talk about a fairly recent live scenario that she encountered. And she has done that personal work of, okay, this is what happened. What have I learned? And so she's coming with some really deep learnings, and then open it up for discussion about that. So that's going to be a great part. So, and then we're trying to leave lots of time for questions at the end. But I do think we're a fairly informal group, so if people do have comments they want to make or ask questions during, please do. We'll see how we can manage it. And just remembering Sharon's comment about being in the zone.
Stay in the zone.
Okay. So the basics, as I said, these are fundamental life skills. They're also, any kind of conflict we know is a key opportunity for learning and growth, but giving and receiving feedback are a subset of that. And there is a ton of brain science which is relevant to this. And so we're going to start with that piece. And I'm going to give a lot of credit to a wonderful article that I read called The Art and Science of Giving and Receiving Criticism at Work by Courtney Cedar, and I will pass that along to Sharon so we can post that as well. It's really worth reading. It's a very helpful article. So the first thing about brain science is that, guess what? Our brains interpret criticism as a threat to our survival. And so, our brains go out of their way to make sure we always feel right even when we're wrong. And criticism, I discovered, is actually a threat to our place in the social order. It goes to our identity, and it goes to who we believe we are in the eyes of others. So when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'd think, okay, feedback or criticism, if you like, might affect my esteem or self-actualization higher up on the pyramid. But in fact, what the brain science shows is that it's a primal threat. It goes down to our sense of belonging and our sense of safety. So if you remember this, the more fundamental and basic pieces are at the bottom. So this is pretty basic stuff. And I thought I'd just give you a list of some of the things that I discovered were brain science aspects. There are probably other ones, so feel free to suggest them. And some of them seem to contradict each other even, but let's go through them just quickly. Our brains cause us to sometimes remember negative feedback inaccurately. Again, our brain tries to save us rather than transform the data. We transform the data rather than ourselves. The other is negativity bias. If we can't transform the data, then we end up remembering negative stuff way more than we do the positive stuff. Have anybody ever experienced that? How, you're meeting with somebody and they're telling you all great things and they go, and just one little thing. And then you go away and you go, oh, that one little thing. And that's the thing that we beat ourselves up about over and over afterwards. So that's just what our brains do. The third thing, confirmation bias, is that can be, our existing thinking can be positive or negative about ourselves, for example. We have a negative thought of we believe we have some sort of weak point. if somebody else says something about that weak point, it's like a magnet, and everything goes to that, to the negative feedback, confirming what we already know about our flaws. So that's another thing. All or nothing thinking, so it's either black or white, and it is or it isn't, there's no gray, and if somebody says something about us, it's true for everything, which runs into the overgeneralization piece. One negative comment means everything is negative, which of course is not true. Catastrophizing is related, that if we have one negative thing said to us, going to lead to ruin. My career is ruined, my professional life is ruined, my marriage is on the rocks. No. And the last thing is the emotional reasoning. So what that means is that we conclude something is true because that's what we feel in the moment. One thing I learned about anxiety, for example, is that we need to realize that feelings are just temporary. And so I will say to people in my life who are anxious, and hope they say the same to me, is that this too will pass. Right? But if we are beginning to draw conclusions about things in the moment based on our feelings only, that's not great, that's just transitory. And some of the materials that I reviewed, highlight the importance of things like CBT, cognitive behavioral theory, that deals with help, and mindfulness, which helps us deal with these things in a positive way. So there is hope, but just keep those things in mind, because whether you're giving feedback or you're receiving feedback, these things are all at play. So let's start with giving feedback. This is, I feel like I'm standing in front of the slides, but there's no...
You can shift to the sides. You've got to the edges.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right, so I'm going to give you a few tools. This is the first one. Neither of them are like perfect, but each one is going to give you a few little, I like checklists, I like tips, the 6 best tips to do this. Well, I'm going to give you a few of those. So the 7 criteria for giving effective feedback is one of them. Number 1 and 2 I found most interesting. So they indicate that really, in order to give feedback, you've got to be seen by the recipient as being credible and trustworthy. And so why do you think that is so critical? I'm going to open it up for anyone who'd like to comment on that. Why do you think credibility and trustworthiness is going to be important?
Now, are you inviting people to have to step forward, or will you repeat a word?
You can just repeat something. If it's like the one sentence, then I'll repeat it. How about that?
The discount factor is really high if you're not credible to the person.
Right, so a discount factor is high if you aren't credible. In other words, the person's not going to listen to you. They're going to discount everything you say unless there's that sort of, so I wondered about any kind of feedback in the context of a relationship where there is no relationship, for example. We're going to talk about online feedback in a little while. And it really colors everything. I thought that was quite interesting. The good intentions piece, we're going to come back to that in a minute because it's really important, I think. Obviously, your timing and your circumstances. You don't give a lecture. That's not going to help. Make it interactive. You've got to be clear, but clear according to whom? If you think something's clear, the person you're talking to may not necessarily, so you have to think about that and check in with them. And it's got to be helpful. Well, that's why I think this list isn't the best one, because what does helpful mean? Probably means something that they can actually work on, they can do something about. If you say, you know what, you're not a fit because your hair is green, sorry Sharon.
Zero green.
Maybe you can do something about that one. Yeah, okay. So the good intentions, if we can go to the next one. Again, I'm going through this pretty quick. This was really helpful because if we're the person giving feedback, we really need to think about what our intentions are. We need to come with good intentions, because if we don't have good intentions, the recipient's going to know that. And they will receive it better if they know you're authentic, okay? And so this is where we get into some of the key pieces around self-management. And we need to check our biases before we go in. And if we come from a sense of fear or, probably more commonly, judgment about someone, I know what's wrong with that person and I'm going to fix it, that's not good. It's not going to go well. And so we need to be mindful, we need to be self-aware, and come to the discussion from a place of caring, was the word that the articles I read used. A place of caring about the other person. Not about yourself, not out of anger, but of caring. So the table here just gives some of the right reasons and wrong reasons, if you like, that were in the articles. And so what it means is you don't just jump right into a feedback session. You need to prepare. You need to prepare yourself, you need to think about it, and you need to get into the right space before you can even begin.
Sounds so reasonable.
It sounds so reasonable, and it is so darn hard. Okay. So more tips for you to think about, and some of these, like the first one, it's all about conflict resolution, right? You know, tackle the problem, not the person, all that. So focus on the behavior, not the person. You know, I am concerned when you do X, not you are an real curiosity, again, conflict resolution principle. Come with questions, ask, don't tell. And what happens when you're telling somebody? Well, they get the feeling that they're inferior, or you think they're inferior, and that's not going to get a lot of traction. So some of the books I read talk about this concept called humble inquiry. There is a book on Amazon by that name, actually, and some of you have probably read it, which talks about the gentle art of asking instead of telling, because telling shuts people down instead of opens it up for a good discussion. And that's true particularly in the workplace. And the person giving feedback must come, again, with humility, a place of caring. So some articles are big into this criticism sandwich. Were you familiar with that approach?
Yeah.
You know, you give them the positive thing, then you slip in the negative thing, and then you end with the positive thing, and you kind of squinch it all together. And so
all of this.
The problem, there's been a lot of criticism about that recently. It's been apparently a way to do this for a long time, but the criticism relates to the fact that everybody knows that that's what's going to happen, and so they don't even hear the positive stuff. They are just waiting for that shoe to drop and wait for the negative stuff. And by then they're lost, and they don't hear the good stuff at the end.
And even if there is no like middle layer, you're still like, and?
Yes, that's right. You brought me in here for my performance review. There must be something you were going to tell me I needed to improve on, right? Yeah. So, so the modified approach, some people suggested that you use positivity as part of your feedback. So you tell them what they do well, and then you say, and I'd love it if you also blah, or I think you do a great job with. Or one thing that could make this even better is, so it's worth trying. I don't know, that's what it said. Obviously be specific and using lots of examples. Don't just say, you know, blah, blah, blah. You've got to say on Tuesday this happened, I felt upset. You've got to own the feedback, so if you're the person giving the feedback, don't say, they think, you know, those people over there think, blah, blah, blah. No, you've got to come from a place where you're owning it yourself. Again, authenticity. The culture. So most of this stuff does come out of workplace, interestingly, but it could be a family culture as well, or an educational culture, where one looks as feedback as just a normal part of what we do around here. You know, we have a regular feedback system, and this is what we do, and it is a gift. It is a gift from me to you because I want you to do well here. I want you to thrive. So and then following up afterwards and giving continuing support. So the person who's, we'll just slip to the next slide.
Can I just interject? In culture, actually, I mean, I think some, like in my own What's Owed Then culture, is actually offering feedback is not accepted part, is that you allow people to self-correct. And so actually telling them what they could do better is not considered respectful behavior at all. Just, yeah. So it would really be sort of modeling what you want to see and then allowing them the time and space to correct themselves.
Is it okay to say how their behavior made you feel?
Yeah.
Okay, and that helps them?
I think to some extent, but maybe even just even not as direct even, but so it's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so bigger cultural issues. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Kerry,
Yep.
on your culture or your sandwich. Sorry, am I in the right place?
Yep.
On your sandwich, the open-faced variant, which is your modified approach, right? Well, because you don't have it on both sides,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it works well. I've found in the context of advising people who are growing up through in our case, a professional environment, or but I suppose it might not necessarily be that, where the expectation is progression, and so you can say, here are all the great things you've done. Now here's how to get to the next stage in your evolution. So it's at that point
Nice. I like that.
it's coaching and very positive mentoring as opposed to being criticism in a negative sense.
Yeah.
And
Awesome.
helpful.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
Oddly enough.
I like this.
Because when she said, when the other slide where it was like the feedback has to be helpful, but it's like, what is helpful, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's when it's related to a goal of
That's
saying
right.
you're trying to achieve the next level, that is helpful.
It is, yeah, and concrete, yeah, well done. So this tool is in the materials. It's one Rosenberg's nonviolent communication tool. Again, very familiar to conflict resolution professionals, and it all sounds easy, but then again, if we put it into our own personal situations, challenging. Probably my favorite resource is the one that Julie, the next one, yeah,
Okay.
was the one that Julie reminded me of. I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown, and she's got tons of wonderful stuff, but she does have this little engaged feedback checklist that is fabulous. And I won't go through all 10 of them, but you know, this is where her very first one is, I'm ready to give you feedback. So I've done my reflection, I'm ready to give you feedback when I can sit next to you, not across from you. Interesting. Just a little test for ourselves. Am I really ready to go and sit beside this person that I'm going to give feedback to? So, and it goes on to the next slide as well. Yeah. So there is a link here, and you can download your own handy dandy little printable PDF that you can put near your desk.
Comes in nice colors.
Yeah. Yeah.
I actually have it. I pulled it off my bulletin board at my office at home. But I was telling Kari it was buried beneath a bunch of stuff, which is why I didn't remember to use this.
That's the thing. You can't memorize everything. Oh. Okay.
Clearly needs to be bigger.
So the next thing is another little checklist, the instant feedback formula. I won't spend any time on that. So giving feedback is challenging, but what I learned was that if we have time to actually prepare to do it, we can do it well. If somebody asks us for feedback and we're not in that place of preparedness, it's okay to say, you know what, I'm just not quite ready to do it today. Can we meet next Tuesday? And I'd really love to talk to you about this. That will, I think, help to avoid some of the problems we can make giving feedback. Receiving feedback, which is the next slide, and I'm going to go pretty quick. There's less out there about this, interestingly, but to me, it's just as important. And so it talks about seeking feedback, not just waiting for it to drop on you, but to go and ask for it, and talks about how to do that well and how to do it often. And then all the things we know about the importance of listening and active listening and being curious and asking questions. This all comes to play in this. And taking time to reflect before reacting. I didn't know that most people actually, their brains only allow them to hear one critical comment at a time, then they're lost. But it's happened to me before. I remember, what do you mean you don't like my whatever? Okay.
Can we just go back to what, like, right? Like, I feel like that in conversations, it's like they keep talking and you're like,
yeah, wait a minute. So if somebody gives you feedback and they say, I have a list of 5 things where I think you might want to improve, we're not going to get past number 1. So let's just deal with number 1 and have another session for number 2 to 5 or 10. Okay. Again, there's the same piece here about, feedback is a gift. Can we actually look at it as a gift? Can we have a growth mindset that this will help us grow and join the embrace failure movement? This is big for me, being involved in an innovation lab where we're supposed to try stuff and expect to fail many times over and over, but to just celebrate the learnings that come from the failure. For the lawyers in the room, does that sound like your culture? No. We've learned that we are supposed to be the experts, and we're supposed to be having the answer, and we're supposed to be right. So it's really hard, but this is true. I've embraced it, and it's true, and applying it to myself is my next frontier.
Can I share? I just want to share, some of you in the room will have been mentored by Tom Northcott as a mediator. But I find it's a little variation on this that he always used that I found really empowering.
Yeah.
Because when he talked to you, when you were learning to do a skill, he would always say, there are no failures, just great recoveries.
Nice! We should coin that. That's amazing. That's great.
Yeah.
And in my little personal example that I gave at the beginning, the resource that I did, thankfully, call on was Bill Eddy's stuff. So the BIF, don't write this long chronology email, no. Write a brief, informative, factual, and firm response if you have to. Don't write anything if you don't have to. And the EAR, empathy, attention, and respect. And those probably saved me in that situation. Okay, really quickly, what about online feedback? I think I'm going to leave most of this for Julie to talk about, but the fact that there's no relationship, offensive comments online are just so hard, again, because they attack Maslow's, very fundamental stuff about who we are, do we belong, are we safe? And some people say, you can use humor as a way, but I think that's really difficult when it's just, you don't know this person and it's not, then it's online, it's not a relationship. So the receiving feedback online, there's lots of options, and I'm talking here about quite a few articles about whether websites or blogs should actually allow comments at all. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful cross-country checkup, I think it was September or late August, I think, on this topic. I'll give the podcast link, and it was all about this, and it had some wonderful stories of people who had actually been involved with trolls and online shaming and so on. It was really well done. So we need to think about it. Then there's a thing called the online abuse playbook, which I will give you also. And the next quote is from that. And things can really escalate out of control quickly on the web. We just need to know that if we're worried about our safety. And so if a web community's decided to dislike a person, topic, or idea, the conversation will shift from criticizing the idea to becoming a competition about who can be most scathing in their confirmation. So it's kind of scary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to share her experience, and then we can talk.
I'm going to talk about one. I was saying I had experience on the weekend of giving some feedback, and I thought, do I never learn? I don't know. I thought I learned, as I'm especially like working with Kari to prepare for today, and I'm like, I don't think I really learned. And it's interesting because that whole idea from professional to personal, right? And in my professional life, have gotten as somebody who is mentored, got really used to getting feedback, and I always really loved the really specific, concrete. Like Richard Singer as a mentor was one of the most awesome people to give feedback. He was really specific and really clear about where your growth could happen, and so that I always really appreciated that. And as a mediator, part of what I really work to do is develop relationships with the other professionals, especially that I work with, and often invite them to in developing those relationships, to give me feedback. Because we do, for child protection, an anonymous questionnaire that gets sent to Victoria and gets compiled in these 6 months or whatever, which is really, actually I tell people, not that helpful, because by then I'm long gone. So I'm not sure if you really have I often invite people, if they have feedback for me in the room, to give it to me then, and I ask them to do so privately, and in order to totally embarrass myself. But and so I felt like I had some really good skills on giving feedback and giving feedback. And then I kind of blamed Duncan McCue in that cross-country checkup episode for what I'm going to talk about next, because actually it was a huge focus of that was after the Colton Boucher killing in Saskatchewan, where the online comments became so vicious that the premier of the province had to step in and tell people to stop commenting, that there were threats made that was incredibly racist and hurtful. And so the question was launched, was like, should there be online commenting? And it was really interesting because I didn't call into the show, but Duncan McCue is really active on Twitter. And so I was tweeting, and I actually got a lot of people, strangers to me would say, because I said absolutely not. Like I feel like this idea of having to respond and be people's educators is an onerous burden that I was done with. But I had a lot of people saying, no, but we'll be there, we'll stick up for you, we're gonna, people need to know. And so I launched into some feedback of my own, which actually I have to say, initially I didn't wade into the fray on this one initially. So on, I think it was late September or late August. Jann Ardens, who I'm a fan of, she's an incredible songwriter, singer in Canada, and I follow her on Facebook, and actually partly because she writes really compassionately and tenderly about caring for her parents, and her father recently passed away, and she has this lovely mother, and she posted this picture on Facebook of her little dog Nettie and her mother on a walk, and social media user, scrolled through it and saw it, and the word Eskimo was like, I had that reaction, and I was like, oh, ouch, that's not cool. And but I didn't comment. I scrolled, but I went back to the story later in the day and saw that lots of people had, and she has lots of really dedicated fans who said, Jann, that's not cool. That's a pretty pejorative word. People don't use that word. There's actually a problem with the sports team in Edmonton being called that word, and a really active movement against the name Redskin, also in professional sports, and the Edmonton Eskimos. So I sort of watched her because I was like, Jann, I think she's a pretty cool person. I'm just curious to see how is she going to respond. So that's actually, I don't know if you can read it, but it was, I think I'm going to call my next record White Ass Bitch, the Eskimo Sessions. So I was like, not cool. And said in a thread, I'm really disappointed by this response. And things sort of, I think if you go there, things really escalated. And
Wow.
so there was
Personal for you. my
yeah, you know, I mean, and part of that was, yeah, I need to grow a pair of ovaries. I have some, I have 5 kids. They were pretty funny. And it really was interesting. And you know, some of the interesting things was that on Twitter as well, I gave her feedback and said, I think what I said was on Twitter, which was, I just said, I thought the appropriate response would be to apologize. And she blocked me like immediately on Twitter. And apparently that's where things got even nastier than Facebook. And so I actually didn't see a lot of people's response to my response on Twitter. And I think this is right after she blocked me. So yeah, so it got pretty heated pretty quickly, and part of it was is that I sort of escalated the attack, and so some of the is that I had posted her response to me as like in a screenshot, and was like, I felt like I'm not a fan of hers anymore. She was not respectful, and a friend of mine who works for CBC asked me if I would be interested, as she was watching sort of the social media sort of take off and go crazy on this. And I mean, to be fair, I was not the only one calling her out on this behavior. There was people, and I felt like my calling her out wasn't, I didn't call her names, I just told her I was disappointed in her response, but there were lots of people who were very vicious to Jann Ardens. And she really felt attacked. And so, you know, in your slides about sort of that trust and credibility, well, I realized I had no trust or credibility with Jann Ardens at all. She didn't know who the heck I was. But I think part of it was like a famous Tanya Tatak, if you've heard that name. She's an incredible Inuit throat singer who won the Polaris Prize as a rising star in Canadian music. Got involved in this as well and had some pretty harsh words for Jann Ardens.
So there is a shift here on the right-hand side. She begins to
Yes,
apologize.
yes, she
Sort of.
starts, yeah.
Sort of.
And yeah, and part of it is like that was, yeah, and early in September, after this story was, I got interviewed by a CBC reporter and was on Daybreak North, and then eCanada picked up the story, that I got a very personal apology. And I,
That's just her. It's like,
yeah,
you don't
so.
have to read it.
One of the things that was interesting to me was that somebody who was a very dedicated fan, or somebody in, I'm not sure how, but because I am listed on Media BC's website or government, you know, as a, found my email address and was sending me some pretty vicious hate mail. And told me that, and then actually part of one of the ones like, I just saw your job title and description. Who the hell, you're like so lacking compassion and whatever. And I was like, right. But yeah, so there's my claim to fame. Like she had suggested that I put that as a pinned post on it. Proudly blocked by Jann Ardens. So it's interesting, she didn't block me on Facebook. So I still have access to her feed on Facebook, but she blocked me like almost immediately on Twitter. So that was part of, like, you know, the #1 lesson I learned was really, like, I was an anonymous fan or non-fan of Jann Ardens. She didn't know who I was, she didn't care who I was. And initially some of her response was actually to heighten the thing, that she didn't immediately go to apology. She escalated it by, you know, the white ass bitch sessions, and then she did a sort of a hashtag I knew it, but I said it anyways. That proved it was deliberate, and I think that if I ever engaged in and if I ever get to, I think that one of the things is that I think a satisfying conclusion for me would actually be to have a conversation with Jann Ardens about this issue and about why the word Eskimo is offensive. And I mean, I think she understands that now, but just all the whole, you know, like, because it's gotten some attention, that the ability to educate people about words and how words matter, and further reconciliation, which is, you know, something that as Canadians that a lot of us are interested in doing and dedicated to doing, and I think that she could have some real positive influence in that. So I would so welcome. And I'm actually trying to, I was in Whitehorse last week, and I have a friend who's a comedian, storyteller, entertainer, and she's friends with Candy Palmeter, who's on CBC, and I'm like, can you get me in? Can you talk to Candy and see if she could invite us to have a conversation about this? Because I'd rather, I mean, I think that some really hurtful, vicious things were said on both sides, and I think that to be able to actually have some use and learning from it would be helpful, right? And the other thing is the private, right? I think at one point she actually said that she didn't mind getting feedback, but she didn't want a public reprimand. And I think that's really valid, right? Like, who of us wants to be labeled as something negative in the public eye? And that would be something for me that I wish that I would have sent her a private message and said, you know, I'm a big fan, I love you, I was really disappointed by how you reacted to this, and you know, can you consider another option? And the advocates, the negative and positive, and especially this one, the negative, like the people who piled on her side and the people who like piled on my side or whatever, that was not helpful at all. They just sort of whipped it into a frenzy. And so really being careful about engaging advocates in that kind of situation, whether it's conflict or feedback, can really make a difference, because just sometimes the sheer numbers make people feel like, so if you're alone and you're trying to give feedback and you're a panel of 3 or whatever, just that imbalance, right, is you know, and that's for me the dialogue, like really inviting a dialogue rather than just a flat out criticism of, and I think, I mean, I have to be fair and say, I don't think once did I ever say, can we talk about this? Do you want to talk about this? And then the whole notion that is floating around now in talking about inclusivity and diversity, and is rather than calling out people, is calling them in, and that I think with the purpose of having dialogue and not shaming people, because you know, I mean, the thing is that we're here to stay. Like we have to interact with each other as people. There's no like them and us, right? Like I think that we sometimes can create those constructs, but to invite people in rather than shaming them and putting them on the outside and excluding them is something that I think will actually lead to a dialogue, which will lead to learning. And so those are some of my lessons, which, you know, I'm trying to learn, but I went to an art show on the weekend that I had this, I don't know, I couldn't believe how overcome I was with emotion at my reaction to this art show. And so I spoke up about my reaction to it, and most of the artists were pretty good about saying, wow, that's not what we expected, but that's what art is about, right? Like getting, and not, there's
not universal.
Not universal, right? And I was like, immediately went like, oh, damage control, what can I do to try to fix this? And although I wasn't sorry for and I'm actually not even sorry for my feedback, but just to be mindful of it. But it's, even thinking about that was so hard, because it's like all those things that you know, and that you know professionally and you know intellectually, was that I was like swept by this wave of fury that I had, and I just couldn't, like I actually sat there and debated, should I speak up, should I speak up, should I say something? And I just thought, I'm gonna hate myself if I wake up tomorrow and I realize that I let the opportunity to share go, but wasn't, I don't know, like I feel like there maybe should be an app that you can do on your phone to go, am I ready to give feedback? Are they ready to hear feedback? Because
Julie.
there's a good idea. Because I didn't clearly think it through in the moment when the wave of fury passed over me. And part of that I take a lot of comfort in. Sharon is saying there's no failures, there's just great recovery. And part of that was actually, I talked to some of them individually, like it was a panel afterwards, and said it wasn't meant as personal attack on your work, or it was that the system, and most of them received it with like, you know, I hear you, I get you, fair criticism, I may not agree with you, but I get you. Lisa.
We're gonna need to step away from the camera.
No, just
Here in that
anyway,
corner.
just over there.
Okay.
As long as
So-
you pass, like, step in front. Yeah.
You're good?
Can I keep my back all down?
No, turn around so everybody can hear you.
What you're bringing up for me is along the lines of unsolicited feedback, and some work and thinking that I've been doing recently on unsolicited feedback is actually locating really deeply inside yourself to realize this isn't about me, it's about the speaker, and that kind of gives you an extra shield to hold space kindly and everything with the feedback, because we may not, if it's unsolicited feedback, it's still valuable and part of the dialogue, but we may not choose to engage in dialogue. And but the best part at that point is when we've given our feedback cleanly, if they have a different response than we're hoping for, we also don't need to engage in that. So there's a real freedom in it in terms of that, the kind of cycle of that.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. That's an important question in terms of how do you do that. It's almost like preparatory work all the time, right? Because if you're there's that opportunity for unsolicited feedback all the time, right? Like, I know, I mean, just being a human being out in the world, right? I remember once being on a city bus going to meet a friend for dinner, and I was on it was a hot July night, and we're all like packed in there, and somebody said to me, "You're fat," and I was like, yeah?
Thanks.
Okay. And I wondered, like as I walked through, I was like, what did he want me to say to that? but absolutely in terms of, and that was sort of the thing I was having on Saturday was, actually they were inviting feedback, right? And it was, I thought it's going to be unpopular feedback, but it was sort of, I mean, I think I still didn't think it out as clearly as I would have, but part of that was, do I need them to do something with that? And for me it was, no, for me it was, I had this burning need, and I recognized that was about me, right? And that's the whole thing about Jann Ardens too, is that initially my disappointing, my comment that this was disappointing, was partly after, as a result, that's why I say I blame Duncan McCue in the check, was reading some articles and thinking about the whole topic of why it's important to call out behavior, because actually being on the receiving end of constant criticism and racism and comments like that actually is a burden for those of us who are receiving it in terms of health, actually has actual health concern, like it builds up and makes us sick if we're just continually receiving it and not questioning it, right? So it was like this, I don't know, it's like this balance where there is no equilibrium, right? Like I feel like, do you do it or not? Like what's going to be the net, what's going to be the outcome? What is going to be the benefit of it? Is it going to be helpful, right? And sometimes I think it's not, and sometimes it is. And I think, that whole question about somebody saying, I just read your job title and job description, like you're the, like how dare you criticize somebody publicly when you have that role? And part of it was like, how dare I, right? Who am I? What does that have to do with it, right? But all of those thinking things about it, right? Which was, and I thought, do people think mediators don't have conflict themselves? Is that a myth we need to dispel? But also being able to resolve that in a helpful way. I don't know, anybody else have any? Yeah.
The public versus private made me think back to one of the early slides on the brain science and the Maslow hierarchy, because when I confess that when I first heard that, I said, yeah, okay, but I mean, it's a bit of a reach. But then when you think of it in terms of public versus private, as I rethought that, the threat to existence is much greater when you, as the recipient of public criticism, see not just one individual coming out with a comment, but one individual, because they're commenting in public, potentially, from the perspective of the recipient, seeing everybody out there ganging up on them. And that's much more of an existential threat than in a private context.
Yeah, and that's so much more about online than in person, right?
Yeah.
Although in person in the States, and apparently that's, apparently, you know, at some political things that is happening in person too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I was only going to comment on that because I think I agree with you, Mark, that it is easier to get your head around it as public. But I mean, a lot of the work that people do that is in brain science really demonstrates that the limbic system gets engaged at a threat to status. And that's really what that is talking about. And it can be very much the private, because how we sit in society and how we view ourselves, it's still a reaction, and it actually does go straight to that core limbic reaction. And it's interesting how it can affect it. And it can, I'll just share, if you don't mind, one of the other things that it does, you can actually react because of our empathy. We'll react to an attack on someone else's status too, which is part of when I'm hearing, you know, the whole let's gang on. We react to attacks on status elsewhere too, and it also engages the limbic system. There's this one exercise that I've done a few times. It's actually done in improv settings. It's kind of a weird one, where people are put up in a group of 3 and they're throwing a ball. And the instructions they've been given, 2 of them have been told, after about 3 throws, exclude the other person, right? The third one has been told, your job is, all of you are counting how many times it's been tossed to each other. So they're really aware. So it switches. The people in the room start getting angry. Everybody feels that attack on status because of exclusion. And it's really quite interesting to see how it triggers actual physiological responses. So but I mean, I agree with you. Obviously, it's escalated when it's public, but it's fascinating if you kind of look at it. The attack affects the personal too.
I think maybe it's also true that a personal one-on-one conversation can inflame that if the person who's giving the feedback is a person of authority or has power over. So if your boss is telling you stuff that you think, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my house, I'm not going to be able to feed my children, it can be that fundamental too. But yeah. Any other comments on that?
Well, I come on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is this also here?
Thank you.
It's that
Yeah,
line.
you're good there.
Okay. So I was on Twitter, and I think I might have liked your tweet or something. But it didn't really go beyond that, but maybe I was one of the unknown millions who were against it. I think there were a lot of, like for me, part of the personal journey I'm going through now is really standing up for what I believe in. And so so my reading of that was, hey, way to go, Julie, standing up for what you believe in. And so I guess it wasn't, and that's the only sort of, and I didn't really think about this shaming, but I think that's a really, I understand that now too. Like I think I'm really glad that you shared that lesson, because that public nature is very shaming. And I've also found it interesting, the comment that you got about your profession. Because recently I got, I guess it was feedback, from a person who was, well, it was arising out of an inquiry about my services, and it was not kind, and it sort of made certain implications about my professionalism. And so going back to like threat to status, like it's very, 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 very core. So, so I don't really know, but there's this really great thing about social media. It's that it brings up this conversation, and would we ever have had this conversation before? So, so anyway, I wanted to really support your sharing and what you did. I really think it was great.
And your courage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Courage.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, and that's, you know, for me, it's interesting because, like, you know, I think the fundamental mistake that I made was that not having a relationship or a trust or credibility. Because I was saying earlier, in my culture, really, that's the only way that you're ever gonna get anywhere, is developing the relationship and the trust with people. And so, and part of that, letting people self-correct, is actually trusting that they will.
Yeah.
It's not about letting people get away with bad behavior or unkind things, or untruths, but really trusting that they will see and self-correct, right? So the trust is fundamental. So I just think, you know, part of that is, like, for me, thinking about my cultural teachings and what I value, and how do I translate that to social media, right? Like, and I don't know, like, I still don't have, I mean, part of it I think is, one of the things that I've started doing is really only limiting, like, especially on Facebook, I'm really quite selective in terms of who I face, or who I trust, or, you know, who I friend and who I accept friend requests from, because there have been, like, I think I've ended up in quite a disagreement with my favorite nephew's new wife. And part of about parenting, which I know is like a don't go there, Julie. And I always say, the only parenting advice I'll give you is never take parenting advice from anybody who hasn't parented at least one child to adulthood successfully. But it was interesting, because I thought, how do I, you know, and my friend Robin Gervais and I've had quite heated arguments about, is social media the place to give feedback or to have debate, right? And I think that's one of the commentaries that I feel, since I've left university, really, there is no space for debate. I like to argue. I'm not a lawyer, but somehow I really like to argue. I love to debate, and there's very few safe places in society for debate, right? I'm like, you know, this far from getting kicked out of my book club because I like to debate, and I'm thinking, isn't that the point of book club? Didn't I start book club? Because I want to argue with people. You guys can't kick me out. But so really being able to, you know, think about creating those safe places for discussion and debate, and you know, and I think there's like, Robin invited me to come with her to some, isn't there like some kind of forum for thinking about, what is it called?
SFU has a dialogue.
Is it a dialogue center?
Yeah.
Center for Dialogue.
I'm not sure what it is.
Center for Dialogue.
Center for
It's a block away from me.
And that they have like once a month lectures or something that you can go, and I think, you know, that the point is to maybe debate, or at least hear things that you wouldn't normally talk about. But I think that for me is, you know, one thing that I think I'd like to do for me as a lesson is maybe channel myself into that, or maybe I need to go back to school or take some courses or something.
I have a question about, I heard,
all the way to
okay. I have a question. I heard that there was an exchange, and I don't go online that often because I'm kind of scared of all this, about some Twitter exchange that went viral because it was polite and it was typically Canadian. Did anybody hear about that?
Yes.
And I wondered if you could comment on that, because I was very curious about this Canadian brand of Twitter, because this clearly was not polite, what we just saw. That was actually shocking. But yeah, I don't know if somebody could comment on that. I'm curious about that. If you
I'm sorry, I can't. Obviously nobody
CD
I
wants
follow.
to.
CD,
You
yes.
gotta get
Lisa,
it.
CD?
So I can go ahead.
You do it, I would go again.
So now they're having a debate about Christopher.
Singularly Canadian.
Why don't both of you come
Yeah.
up?
Yeah.
Oh.
There you go. There's a good
Thanks, Sharon.
So could you say the question again?
I just want to hear about that
The polite.
Canadians are supposed to be polite Twitterers, like it went
Oh.
viral, this polite thing.
So there was a radio host in Ottawa who posted something, it was in response, I believe, to something that had happened with Trump or some of the misogynist stuff that had come out. So his tweet was, now that's another reason to teach my girls something, or to teach girls something. And a person came back right away, another man came back right away.
A journalist from the States, or from somewhere else in Canada, but responded about that sort of being an unfortunate response, that maybe it's that we need to teach women. We
need to teach men not to engage in that behavior.
And then eventually it was that it's not women that we need to teach, it's men that we need to teach.
And so then he came back and said, to clarify, I'm actually the father of 2 daughters. So my context about teaching girls was in the context of I'm a parent of daughters.
And he responded that he had boys, I think it was, too. And so, and then with the context, then totally makes sense where you were, how you're coming from at this. And
immediately apologized. I'm so sorry for overstepping. I reacted without understanding the facts, and then which is amazing. And then there was pile on from both directions. So there was a ton of pile on where they're like, so and so, you shouldn't have responded, and so it flamed out sideways on both sides.
And through this whole interaction, because of course, the focus on women needing to learn something here, and then the focus on men, both had their own sort of pile-ons.
Yeah.
And then towards the end, they actually had an interaction, these 2 primaries, of, should I delete this? Because I'm noticing that you're getting a lot of blowback for this comment. Yeah. So would you like me to delete my tweet so that we don't actually, you're not getting this kind of thing? Yeah.
And his response was, no, because the good in this is way better than the bad. And you and I have, it's so important that you and I understand each other, and we can let all the rest of this stand. Yeah. So it got picked up worldwide.
I really like that.
Thank you. And what a good demonstration of
Except
being
that
respectful.
it's hard to say that it's typically Canadian when you look at the Bushy situation in Saskatchewan, which totally went, that was Canadians, I assume, may have been other people, responding in such a terrible, harmful way. Yeah. I'd just like to tell one little story about the public-private thing. And Julie and I have talked about this. On the cross-country checkup, one of the early callers was a woman who was she's a researcher in gender issues, and had written a blog and had a post on pay equity. And she got a terrible, terrible comment, a number of them, from somebody to her blog. And it was somebody she knew, but knew sort of they were in the same network. It wasn't a close friend, but it was an acquaintance. She knew who this person was. So then she did what I failed to do, which is step back and reflect on, okay, what do I do about this? Because that's one thing about it, when they're not face to face, you actually have some time to think. And so she had kind of an elegant solution. Is she sent in a private message. She did not respond online. A private message saying, would you like to talk to me about this? Here is my phone number and my email address, and get in touch with me. I'd like to talk to you. And the key was, she said, I would really like to listen to you. And he did. He called her, and they had a couple of conversations about it. And nobody else in the social media would have known this was going on, but he changed his approach significantly. Didn't write the same sort of vicious things at all, and could kind of understand where she was coming from, I assume. So I thought, all right, that's a go private. Private.
And also the invitation to listen, not tell, right?
I want to tell you everything that you're wrong about. No, I think CD, and then Mark, do you mind?
I have a quick clarification question for you, Kari. Did he then go back and change his comment?
Okay, the question was, did he then change his comment? She didn't say that, no. So I don't know.
The one, sorry, Mark.
No.
The one reason I'm sort of asking is because when we're doing this sort of feedback thing in a social media public forum, and then we go sort of offline or into sort of a private forum, I think it's important that there is some sort of return to the public for some sort of work through or just demonstration that there's been some work through, because otherwise, like reading things, the story ends in a really weird spot, and you actually don't know how people have dealt with it, and I don't know if that's an important part, so that's what I'll ask you.
That's a lovely piece on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was sort of the same direction I was going, except let me put it perhaps more forcefully. I don't think it's just disappointingly unresolved. I think the risk is you've left the misstatement in public without all of the stuff. I think there's a responsibility to come back in the public sphere.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. I was strengthening my argument for continuing the discussion, right? Is that certainly, I mean, I can convey that I learned a lot of things from this, and I certainly never intended to shame Jann, right? And that's initially where, you know, first, and I think that part of it was, you know, for me, I'm really terrible in text. I end up misunderstanding or not being able to, just maybe it's laziness about typing, I don't know, fully explaining myself, right? Which was, if I perhaps had started actually my feedback with saying, you know what, I think I follow you because I love your exquisitely tender, compassionate writing about your life and your life with your parents, and I just feel like this, you know, wasn't on par with the rest of who I think you are, like me, you know, like, and that probably would have given me some credibility to have that discussion. And I'm always, you know, I'm a sucker for do-overs. I do. I like it when I failed spectacular and somebody gives me an opportunity to do it again. I always like, oh yes, even if I'm gonna crash and burn again.
So how do you develop a relationship online? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, but how do you feel when you just say, I find that disappointing? You're not doing anything except saying how you feel about a comment.
Do you want to come up if you're going to
Yeah.
talk about it?
Come up and ask it.
More than
Come up
free
the
will.
rest. Yeah. You're past the point
Oh,
where you're allowed
I'm
to
sorry,
sit there.
sorry.
Step their shine
Okay,
up.
I'm just saying, well, how can you see that as a failure when you're actually just commenting, I'm disappointed about your comment? Like, you're expressing your feelings about something, you're not calling somebody out, you're just saying, I'm disappointed, and like, I don't see that as a failure.
Well,
I'm
I
saying
mean-
it's being honest. I don't know.
I think, I mean, partly, it was sincere, but I also think that we need to think about, especially online or in public, the effect of those words, and part of that, the advocacy that went with it, right? And that, I think what Sharon was saying is that that people's wanting to sympathize or support one side versus the other, that if there isn't enough context given, that the likelihood of it, the argument going beyond just that's a disappointing statement or a disappointing response to end up being like, you're a terrible person, right?
Right. Well, and I mean, I would go further than that, because I think the implication of you using that word disappoints me is you're a racist, right? Like, I think that it is a natural implication from there. And so standing by itself while you're stating, while you're stating that, you know, you actually are disappointed and I'm just sharing my own feelings.
It's the judgment.
It leaves this sense, and I think it's inevitable that what you've done is shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just,
Yeah.
I'm gonna just throw something out there too,
Yeah.
which is that it's also not gonna just be read standalone. So a lot of the time you might be posting, hey, I'm really disappointed, this sucks, but what the person receiving that feedback is reading is, you're a racist, you're a bleep, 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 hey, I'm really disappointed, this sucks,
Right.
and also you suck, and then,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
and it's all part of a single story for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if Julie is onto something, that there needs to be a way to develop a relationship, to give feedback that's effective and meaningful, how do we do that online? What are the ways that we can do that before we offer comments?
Can I have a shot? Because the way you've expressed it in part earlier on, is creating the trust relationship and observing that you can't do that in the public online sphere, but it's harder. But at least a partial substitute for the creation of that relationship is what you described as contextualizing. So if you don't have the one line, I'm disappointed, but rather I'm of Wet'suwet'en and come at it from that perspective, and a fan of yours, and in that context my reaction was X. I mean, it's hard to spew all that stuff out, but if you do, it makes it at least creates the context as part of the message.
Probably means don't use Twitter, because you can't do that 140 characters.
No, it means
I've heard of
Facebook.
Twitter.
Yeah.
It means
Yeah.
Facebook,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which was interesting because I kind of thought about that. What was hard for me about that was how many people were saying, I'm this, you know, I'm Indigenous, like I'm Inuit or I'm whatever, and that doesn't offend me. Right. So it was that whole other argument where I was like, right, and that was actually part of what really compelled me. Like when CBC phoned me and said, "Can we do an interview?" Was that what I really wanted to convey was words do, and I said this on the CBC interview, was words do matter. That for as an Indigenous person, as a Wet'suwet'en woman. In this day and age, I want to be called by the name that I say it's okay to call me by. It's not okay to call me a name that I feel is offensive to me and is inaccurate. And so that was, you know, so that was sort of an argument. But I definitely, I mean, still think, yeah, there's lots I could have done different, lots I would do different, and yet at the same time that being able to have these discussions as a result of that is, you know, one of, I mean, you know, hopefully, I mean, I think, you know, when she talks about her own pain that she felt like that she's, you know, that it really hurt her to have those things said about her. I could feel real compassion for her, because as I was getting the emails too, I was like, people don't even know me, and they can say all these terrible things about me, right? Yeah.
But I think also one thing that kind of helped me was to understand where Jann was coming from too when she posted that picture of her mother, and who has Alzheimer's, and she's taking care of her, trying to keep her warm, and then says the words on the post in Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. To get any kind of feedback about that at all isn't just an attack on Jann, it's an attack on her mother, and she is her mother's protector.
Right.
So that raises a whole nother layer of why she reacted so aggressively at the beginning and only later pulled back. I can kind of get that, you know? I can kind of get that.
Yeah, and that was helpful for me to understand that too, right? Because I think that people who were criticizing her use of the word weren't trying to criticize her mother, but that she didn't, you know, that to her was all mixed up in that ball of wax there. Yeah. So helpful. Have it all now.
Julie's never having a problem again.
Does anybody have a personal story they'd like to share that weighs in on this issue? Any kind of personal experience that you'd like to share?
It's not so much, I guess it's just the difficulty of, I'm thinking more,
Much further forward.
Hi everyone. Performance, like more in the work context, I find that extremely challenging when there's, you know, a performance issue, and how to make that, you know, and when you know that maybe it'll improve, but likely it won't. And so what do you do? How do you have that conversation with people? And I think it's the sandwich, right? You know, and especially in that performance mode, you're like, oh, you know how to do that really well. I think the progression thing is really important, but yeah, I just, you know, that's probably my biggest challenge. And then of course, with your teenage children, or your children, giving feedback in your family is probably the worst minefield. But
Giving it or getting it?
But the performance one is when I
And you're talking about when you are the supervisor.
Yeah,
giving
exactly.
feedback.
There's that, as you pointed out earlier, Carrie, an authority, a power,
Yeah.
potential power imbalance. And
Yeah.
this idea of sitting beside someone, I thought was an interesting one. But there are times where you formally need to sit across from someone. So knowing, I mean, I'd be curious about exploring that idea of like when you sit beside someone and work on something. But anyway,
You know, it's interesting because actually I was in a mediation on Friday and it was a different context, but if somebody wanting to really be truthful about what the real problems were going forward and not wanting to be offensive or to hurt them or to drive them away or to have them shut down on it. And I was in a caucus brainstorming and with this lawyer and client about what they were going to say and how they were going to say it. And one of the things that we came up with in that brainstorming was saying, in order to move forward, and we both want to move forward, we need to build this foundation. And the basic of that is honesty and truthfulness about what the situation is. And it really was like just that whole like, so I'm going to say some really hard things, right? And not sugarcoating the hard things, but based on the ability that it's about going forward rather than just shutting it down, right? Yeah, and I just
because
was like,
sometimes you have to actually
yeah, you have
be
to
really
say
honest, like this is not up to par. Like, it's
say
not
some
working.
really hard things
Yeah.
about somebody's behavior or performance or
Yeah.
yeah.
But the side-by-side thing is interesting too. I'm sort of thinking in the context of talking to people, and especially with kids, I find, the best conversations sometimes happen in the car
They're driving.
when you're sitting side by side.
They're strapped
And
in.
you're not like this across the table. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought there were some interesting pieces in there, but
Yeah, I kind of want to build on that a little bit, if you don't mind, actually, just because when I'm hearing it, because I actually like the way you're framing it as side by side in a literal way in the car, but I also heard it as metaphoric. That when you're ready to sit down side by side versus across the table from somebody as being a metaphor for being in a mental state to do what Julie was saying. And that framing that was brainstormed in that mediation strikes me as very much about finding the metaphoric space in which, here we both jointly want to go together and resolve a problem, and the one foundation we need is honesty. That is, to me, a side-by-side conversation. I don't know, I didn't read the context in which Brene Brown sets it up, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was the metaphorical there as well.
She could have been referring to both.
I think both make sense, yeah.
And just to build on that, when I'm giving feedback, my office is set up such that you're necessarily across the table from somebody. If I'm giving feedback to somebody and it's all positive and everything is wonderful, the fact that we're sitting opposite each other doesn't put us adverse in interest. It's still very cooperative and all happy. It's the nature of the conversation that makes it adverse, not the physical position. I think that once the conversation moves into the negative, if it needs to, that is a barrier, and if I was sitting next to them, the barrier would still be there, I think, in most cases. It's more than just the physical to take yourself out of that environment, I think.
And yet, the physical makes a difference to the kind of dialogue we have. So you look at what happens when you have a circle conversation where there is no table. A lot of people, that just terrifies them. They the table is a bit of they like the barrier. It's protection, it's a buffer. You take that away and really you're sitting next to a whole bunch of people and across from a whole bunch of other people. And it changes the nature of the whole dialogue. It's astounding. I've seen it, we did it at Media ABC board meetings. And it changed things. So, who knows? Other examples?
Yeah, receiving feedback.
You see, I think also, Angela, when you're talking about, oh, I can't be over there. Okay. Sorry to stand in front of you. When you're talking about that situation with the supervisor and the supervisee, it is difficult, not just because of the power, but because you know, you can only control yourself. You can only manage yourself and how you deliver things. You can't control how they receive it. And what we learned from the brain science is you can't even control what's really going into their ears, right? Because what the extent to which they're going to hear what you have to say. And so there's only so much that you can do. And so being as honest and forthright and looking to mentor and encourage them if you can is probably all we can do, right? And then follow up. Say, okay, we had this conversation. How did it go? What do you remember from it? Should we go to numbers 2 to 5 now? I don't know.
I since there was a parenting question, I'm going to take that as soliciting parenting.
Yeah, go for it.
No, it just reminds me of Calvin and Hobbes. Have you ever seen when he actually gives his dad like a performance review and fails him? I think humor is the best way to go in giving feedback to your kids and receiving it. And I don't know, my daughter's in the audience, and I just think I remember the first time when she was a teenager that we had a discussion about something and we had a disagreement, and then she left my office and said, "Bitch!" and she slammed the door, and I was like, "Yes! I'm a real mother now!" Right? And she was my oldest, right? And I just was like, you know, if I thought this is part of the job, this is when I set firm boundaries, this is what's going to happen. But I think humor was for me what helped me survive, and you know, doors that locked. Sorry, can't hear you. Yeah, I invite anybody else.
Were there any online questions?
I've been
yes.
I should have apologized. I always feel guilty if I forget to mention that I'm sitting on the phone because I'm watching for online messages, as opposed to because I'm like the one person who's not paying attention in the room and doing other stuff. Yeah. So just to be clear, the only thing I've been doing on my phone during this is looking for messages. I haven't had any.
Okay.
So it looks like we don't have any coming in. But I mean, we're very close to time anyway, so I'm inclined to thank our speakers for actually bringing a really interesting discussion. Kari, Julie, a fantastic opportunity to hear about a really interesting topic. And I will just remind people, check November 15th on your calendars.
CD?
CD, do you want to come talk about it?
Yes.
Because CD and I have not talked about this. We just talked about the fact that it will be something.
Yeah, we haven't done a whole lot of some of that sort of stuff, but one of the things that we're going to do with CoRe and with some support from some other organizations is do a little bit more, so that CoRe will have their normal ethics workshop, which is really sort of hands-on kind of thing, and we're going to figure out, we're setting up to make it more available to the online audience, because we think it's important that this kind of thing be exported to the rest of the province. And then a month later, as part of the reflexive side of this thing, once we've actually gone through a lot of the scenarios, then we're going to take some more scenarios and unpack the other scenarios that we used in the workshop and relate them back to Mediate BC's standards and guidelines for mediators and our complaint process, and more importantly, then how do you set that up at the beginning of your mediation using your agreement to participate? And how do those three aspects align to what we're doing in the mediation process? So it'll be November 15th and December 15th.
Okay, you do have a date.
Second part.
That's why I haven't been announcing the date, because I haven't heard the date.
Yeah, we tried to chat on, and things just fell apart.
It didn't work.
But there's that one.
Okay,
I have two
excellent.
other things.
Okay,
Can I
go
mention?
for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
The other one is, if any of you are interested in doing more writing about conflict resolution.
Yes, this is a good one.
We do have, CoRe has the writers group that meets usually Friday mornings and often Saturday mornings as well, from 10 to noon.
Yes.
In various places around the Lower Mainland, and I think sometimes to make space for online participation. So it's
sometimes we do call in, sometimes we do just all online. So yeah.
And for anybody that's recently participating in Mediate BC's sort of practice development session, sort of building the business side of things, the writing and getting out there, getting your voice out there as someone who does dispute resolution or conflict resolution, or as I've recently been trying to remember it, say it's peace building or peacemaking, that writing is part of it, and finding a time to dedicate yourself to actually writing is really important. And so that's a space to do that, and we will be focused this Friday on blog posts, and specifically blog posts for Conflict Resolution Week, which is coming up in November from the 19th to the 26th. Of course, there's events, and we encourage all of you to do events or write for us as well to get sort of the word out. And for this one on Friday, which I would like to invite you to at 10 in the morning at Waves at the corner of Howe and Smythe. There's a little room that we can sort of use to sort of sit down and take some time. But I'll be bringing in some topic ideas as well. So if you're not sure what to write on, I'll have some canned stuff there as well. And I'll also have a number of platforms. So it's not just you have to have your own, but Mediate BC has a blog, and nobody
CoRe has a blog.
Yeah, and I treat the Mediate BC one because I'm the one that I say curates that one, because I don't think anybody wants to hear from me because I'm not a practicing mediator. So I prefer to have things from all of you there, and I've got some other platforms lined up for Conflict Resolution Week. So those are my 2 plugs.
And there's several people who are bloggers who will be at that session. So what will end up happening is discussion about where to place blogs. So if you're interested in doing your first one, there'll also be writing time. So bring a laptop or whatever you want to do. We will actually write. You'll have a chance to get feedback. You'll have a chance to make partnerships for writing. And you probably will get your first blog post done. So it's really probably worth doing if you've hesitated about it. There's another one coming up afterwards, so check the Mediate BC stuff, because there's one on press releases as well that we're doing in order to make sure people actually get press releases out and into the newspapers for Conflict Resolution Week. So we're trying to kind of mutually support on these. So I encourage you to do those things. Did you want to mention the Mediators Lounge? Is that this week too?
Please go ahead.
All right. Well, no, I can do it because while I didn't bring it for this purpose, I actually have a little show and tell item and props for this one. So this week's Mediate BC Vancouver Mediators Lounge is going to be held in New West. It's at El Santo Restaurant, which is awesome. Darcy and I went and checked it out last week. It is so good. It's well worth going. There's a great back room, which is going to be kind of private conversation time. And Amanda Semenoff is going to be there with a really cool card game that is created entirely to be a collaborative tool. So it's a collaborative card game called Zombie Fight or Flight. And so it's a chance to actually check that out, but it's also just a chance to sit down and meet other mediators and have a conversation about what's cool. Joan is going to be there too, right?
Yes.
I didn't want to say it without checking with you, but you are going to be there. So Joan Braun will also be there. She is also an expert in zombie fight or flight, having been one of the creators. You got a lot of creators in the room, actually. Anyway, thank you all very much, and I think we've kept you past the time now because now we had way more announcements than intended. But thank you, and thank you. Really appreciate it. I actually brought that for you.